In the news tonight, His Majesty the King says all Arab and Islamic countries should join in the fight against terrorism. Foreign tourists and 2 Tunisians are killed when gunmen storm a museum in the Tunisian capital. Jordan condemns the attack as a cowardly act of terrorism. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pledges to form a new governing coalition quickly after his election win that marks a shift to the right. Good evening and welcome to a new edition of the news. Gunmen in military uniforms stormed Tunisia's National Museum, killing 20 foreign tourists and 2 Tunisians. It was one of the worst militant attacks in the country that has largely escaped the region's Arab Spring turmoil. Prime Minister Habib Assid said visitors from Italy, Germany, Poland and Spain were among the dead in the assault on the Bardo Museum near the parliament in central Tunis. A government spokesman said security forces stormed the former palace around 2 hours later, killed 2 militants and freed other tourists held hostage inside. 1 policeman was killed in the police operation. In a national address, the Prime Minister urged all Tunisians should be united after the attack, which he said was aimed at destroying the Tunisian economy. The attack is a blow for the small North African country that relies heavily on European tourism and has largely avoided major militant violence. European Union Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini said Daesh militants were behind the attack. She pledged full support for Tunisia in the fight against terrorism. Jordan condemned the deadly attack on Tunisia's National Museum as a cowardly act of terrorism and declared full solidarity with Tunisia. Minister of State for Media Affairs and official government spokesman Mohammed al-Momeni said Jordan strongly denounces targeting innocent civilians and taking tourists as hostages. He said Jordan stood by the government and brotherly people of Tunisia fighting extremism and terrorism. Momeni reiterated Jordan's denunciation of all forms of terrorism regardless its sources and motives and calls for a collective world effort to combat this plague, which constitutes the biggest threat to international peace and security. The spokesman offered Jordan condolences to Tunisia and the families of the victims and wished the injured a speedy recovery. The United Nations said it expects Israel to continue with the Middle East peace process to negotiate a Palestinian state after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was re-elected. The right-wing Israeli leader has pledged to abandon the 2-state solution. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon welcomed the preliminary results of the Israeli election and urged the new government, once formed, to create the conditions for a negotiated final peace agreement. He called for a halt to illegal settlement buildings in the occupied Palestinian territories and again urged Israel to resume transfer of tax revenues to Palestinians. The Israeli Prime Minister pledged to form a new governing coalition quickly after his election victory. Here's more on the election outcome.
Benjamin Netanyahu is poised for a record stint as Israeli Prime Minister after an upset election victory that was built on a shift to the right. Exit polls after the toughly contested polls show the Likud leader securing 30 seats ahead of the opposition Zionist Union alliance on 24. The result was a dramatic and unexpected victory for Netanyahu. The last opinion polls 4 days before the vote had shown Likud trailing the Zionist Union by 4 seats. Against all odds, a great victory for Likud. Netanyahu tells his cheering supporters in a speech at party election headquarters in Tel Aviv. Leader of the Zionist Union, Isaac Herzog, would not concede defeat, as the race to forming the government will require 61 seats for majority in the 120-member Knesset.
This result allows us to return to power, and since we will wait for the real results, as we are still looking at polls, everything is open.
The election was also a victory for the United List of Arab Parties, which secured 13 seats, forming the 3rd largest coalition. The the Arab list have pledged to stop right-wing parties from forming the next government.
Our people never break a promise. We had an increase in the percentage of votes more than any time in the last 15 years. This is a big achievement for our people. We are the surprise of these elections. We will be the third power in the parliament. With our hands, we will prevent the right-wing parties from forming the coming government.
With Netanyahu's vow to block a Palestinian state to be created under his watch, Palestinians expressed their dissatisfaction and urged the international community to pressure the right-wing leader to change his policy towards them.
Well, I think the results of the Israeli elections indicate business as usual. It seems to me that Mr. Netanyahu will form the next government in Israel. And we all heard what he said yesterday. He said if he is re-elected as a prime minister in Israel, Mr. Netanyahu said he will not allow a Palestinian state. He will continue with settlement activities and dictations.
Despite the win, a rough ride lies ahead for Netanyahu. He now faces the rough task of cobbling together a governing coalition which will take weeks. He will seek the support of traditional rightist allies and the backing of king-making centrists. Rada Blush for the news at 10.
Canada says it plans to extend and expand its mission against Daesh terrorist group in northern Iraq. Prime Minister Stephen Harper announced the move but said Canada would provide more details later. The mandate of the 6-month Canadian mission ends in early April. Canada has around 70 special forces operating in northern Iraq. It has also provided 6 jets to take part in U.S.-led bombing missions against Daesh. Meanwhile, U.S. and coalition forces conducted 11 airstrikes against Daesh fighters in Iraq during a 24-hour period, while U.S. forces led 2 airstrikes in Syria. In northern Iraq, the Iraqi army military campaign against Daesh continued for the 3rd week. More than 20,000 troops are taking part in the operation to retake the key city of Kirkuk. U.S. officials said a U.S. Predator drone that was lost over Syria yesterday was likely shot down. The U.S. military has not commented on the possible cause of the incident. A Syrian army source said the plane was brought down by Syrian air defenses over Latakia province. Latakia is part of the western region of Syria, where the government has been consolidating state control. It was the first such incident since the U.S.-led coalition began airstrikes against the hardline militant Daesh group in Iraq and Syria last summer. American and Iranian nuclear experts homed in the technical details of a possible framework agreement on curbing Iran's nuclear program in a fresh round of talks in the Swiss city of Lausanne. U.S. Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz and Ali Akbar Salehi, the head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, kicked off the negotiations. They were later joined by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, his Iranian counterpart Mohammad Javad Zarif, and European Union Political Director Helge Schmidt. Speaking to Iranian news media, Salehi said that 90% of the technical issues were resolved. Later he said there were 1 or 2 remaining issues. A U.S. official said any framework agreement settled this month would need to have key details, including specific numbers. And coming up next, Jordan to host the World Economic Forum in May, but after this break.
اكفل طعامهم وعزة نفسهم. كية أم علي لعيش كريم.
Here at home, His Majesty the King discussed with Arab Parliament Speaker Ahmed Al-Jarwan development in the region and counter-terrorism efforts. At a meeting at Al Husseiniya Palace, King Abdullah said efforts would be ramped up to combat terrorism and extremism through a comprehensive strategy. He said efforts to achieve Palestinian-Israeli peace should be given momentum towards the goal of setting up an independent Palestinian state within a just and comprehensive solution. The meeting also dealt with the situation in Syria, Iraq and Libya. The King congratulated Al-Jarwan on his re-election for a new term as head of the Arab Parliament. Al-Jarwan offered his condolences for the King over the martyrdom of pilot Mu'adh al-Kasasbeh. King Abdullah also welcomed Indonesia's presidential envoy to the Middle East and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Alwi Shihab. Shihab handed the King an invitation from Indonesian President Joko Widodo to attend celebrations on the 10th anniversary of the Asian-African Strategic Partnership and the 60th anniversary of Asian-African Summit, scheduled to be held in Jakarta next month. His Majesty said a collective pan-Arab and Islamic effort is needed to confront terrorism and clarify the true Islamic values. Shihab said Indonesia is willing to further boost ties with the kingdom, adding that Jakarta is appreciating His Majesty's effort to bring stability to the region. Also welcoming a Hungarian delegation by National Assembly Speaker László Kövér, His Majesty said Jordan is looking forward to forging broader relations with Hungary. King Abdullah said parliaments in both countries had the key role of advancing ties through mutual coordination on various issues of common interest. He also spoke about effort to ward off the danger of terrorist organizations to preserve regional security and stability. László also had meetings with Senate President Abdulrauf al-Rawabdi and Lower House Speaker Hatif Tarauni. Rawabdi said Jordan had made big leaps in comprehensive reform despite the Arab Spring. Tarauni also told the Hungarian team that Jordan has forged ahead with reform and remained a stable country despite political and security turbulence in the region. A conference titled Jerusalem, the City of Peace, will take place in Turkey's capital Ankara on Saturday. The gathering will be led by His Majesty the King and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. The conference will discuss means to counter Israeli attempts to Judaize Jerusalem and encourage religious tourism by Muslims and Christians to the Holy City. The World Economic Forum on the Middle East and North Africa is scheduled to be held at the Dead Sea on May 21st till the 23rd. The theme of the rally of this year is creating a regional framework for prosperity and peace through public-private cooperation. More than 800 government, business and civil society leaders from some 50 countries are expected to participate. The meeting will address the shared and urgent imperative in driving economic and social advancement, particularly for youth. The emphasis in the gathering will be placed in translating emerging new investment, infrastructure and energy partnership among the Gulf region, the Levant and North Africa. The WEF was last hosted in Jordan in 2013 in partnership with King Abdullah II Fund for Development. This year will mark the 8th meeting with Jordan as a host.
Overriding, obviously, imperative to counter in a comprehensive way, counter violent extremism. This is what's driving the dialogue internationally about the region. Of course, there is the security component, which is known, and Jordan is taking such courageous leadership on that front. But many personalities and many realize, of course, His Majesty, Her Majesty, also leaders in the region and internationally, that this is a holistic, comprehensive undertaking which involves education, which involves the involvement of everyone in making sure that there is a strong, inclusive and humane vision for the future. And this is something that will really underpin the gathering that we will convene here at the end of May.
Jordan will next month take over the rotating presidency of the United Nations Security Council. Jordan was president of the Security Council for January 2014 after the kingdom was elected to a two-year term that expires at the end of this year. A designer from Sao Paulo is working with the city to make use of fallen trees to turn them into furniture. More than 1,700 trees fell throughout the city as a result of powerful storms, leaving the city asking what it could do with all the wood and fallen trunks throughout the city. Sao Paulo asked artists and other residents to find ways to make use of the fallen trees, and one artist, Hugo Franca, has answered the call. Franca takes the fallen trees and designs the sculptures and then cut them to shape using a chainsaw. Once complete, the works become living art that residents can relax on and children can play on. We begin with tennis. A misfiring Rafael Nadal had trouble hitting the mark, but the third-seeded Spaniard still had enough to beat American Donald Young 6-4, 6-2 and advance to the fourth round of the PNB Paribas Open. Nadal, a three-time champion at Indian Wells, looked out on sorts in a slopey opening set, slamming an easy overhead into the net to give Young an early break and then later double faulting to head over another. But the 47th ranked Young was no better at finding the target, saving just 2 of 8 break points at Nadal as Nadal walked off stadium court with the victory.
Game, set, and match. Verde.
And over to New York, international soccer stars are hoping to turn more Americans onto the sport as they strike a pose in the Big Apple with the Champions League trophy. This year's Champions League final will be held in June in Berlin. Spanish striker David Villa is getting lots of buzz in the U.S., where he currently plays for Major League Soccer NYCFC. Asked about his year's Champions League final, he said it's difficult to predict who will win because so many teams could go the distance. The trophy is making its debut on top of the Empire State Building as part of a tour that hopefully will help get Americans excited about the sport and the next Champions League final. Finally, let's have a look at the weather forecast. Chilly tonight in most areas with a slight chance for light rain in the country's east. Winds will be northwesterly fresh. Tomorrow, fresh weather is forecast for much of the hilly areas and pleasant in the Jordan Valley with a low of 24 degrees at the Dead Sea. Aqaba should expect pleasant conditions tomorrow as well with moderate winds and slightly high seas. Here are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. And to end the news, here's a recap of our top stories. His Majesty the King says all Arab and Islamic countries should join in the fight against terrorism. "24 tourists and 2 Tunisians are killed when gunmen storm a museum in the Tunisian capital. Jordan condemns the attack as a cowardly act of terrorism. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pledges to form a new governing coalition quickly after his election win that marks a shift to the right. And with this we come to an end. I'm Farah Ajlouni. Thank you for watching and have a good night.